And welcome everyone to I think this is hour 2 or hour 3 of the Microsoft 365 virtual marathon. We're excited to have you here. We had some hiccups earlier on with the keynote because you're only allowed to run 15 live events at one point in time, and I think we are at about 21 live events. So we've had to move some of the other miles across to a different tenant. Please look out for some information pertaining to that. I think a mail will go out to all the registrants or attendees that have registered about how to switch over. I think it's from mile 15 onwards. We're lucky to have gotten in at the right time, so this is still working. In today's second session of the day, Drew, I do not know how to pronounce your surname. Trust me, I have the same problem with mine. Is it Madelung?
That's correct.
Oh, well done. Well, Drew Madelung will be presenting a session titled Securing Teams, SharePoint and OneDrive in Microsoft 365. And without any further ado, I'll hand over the reins to you, Drew.
Thank you very much, Alistair. So first of all, we know why we're here today, to talk about the Microsoft 365, and it is good to kind of be at the front of this. And again, we're here because of all of the wonderful sponsors. So there actually are some rooms out there. If you wanted to go out and stop in them, you can get to those links from the landing page. Go stop by and say hello. We are doing some giveaways. So make sure you do submit your answers to win the raffle. There's some pretty cool stuff out there that you can win. And one of the really cool things for this event is we're getting 10% of the funds from sponsors are going to community relief. So if you do want to provide any more donations, please consider donating through the United Way or the International Medical Corps as well. So first of all, a little bit about me. My name is Drew Madelung. I'm located up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. News about me is I just recently had a little girl. I already put a headset on her. But I am a Microsoft MVP and I do Office 365 consulting. So I help a lot of companies move into Office 365 or Microsoft 365. And I do play a lot work a lot in the regulated industries. So whether it's, I've been doing financial services for around 2 years now, and I was working with public utilities before that. And I've done a little bit of healthcare in my background too. So I've always kind of been in the security and compliance space. And now today, I'm going to talk to you about securing Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and really giving you a high level of what I see as the key things that you need to get started and just kind of the landscape of how you can secure things overall. So I'm really going to jump into certain areas, especially around data loss prevention, sharing for external, and jumping pretty good into classifications around the new sensitivity classifications that we have. But why is security and compliance, and especially for data, becoming so, why is this type of topic important? And I'd say what's happened with COVID these days has been very unique for the work in the world that we live in, to see data travel, to see data move. The amount of conversations I've had in the last 3 months around securing Teams it's a lot. And a lot of that is because people were used to going to an office and having a secure endpoint that they'd come into and access a secure location through a secure location. But then all of a sudden you get funneled into your house and you lose certain areas of security control. You start to lose boundaries. And the boundaries that we were burdened in within offices are not the same. And regardless of whether COVID is driving it or other things, being able to work anywhere and provide access, secure access to information is what's important. And we do live in a world that isn't just Microsoft, right? People need to work and collaborate with people in other platforms. And how do we make sure that if I have I'm working on a file in Teams, I move that file and I email that file into someone and they move that file into Dropbox and they move into Salesforce? How do we know that that content is secure? Because we have all of these different areas of when data needs to be shared, whether we're sharing it with project team members, with clients, with customers, whatever your business is in, they're sharing that information somewhere. And I always like to, when I ask customers if, or anyone who, if they have external sharing, like, what do you guys do for external sharing? They say, oh, we have it off. And you say, well, do you have email turned on? And they say, of course we have email. And you say, well, then you don't have external sharing turned off, because all you're doing is you're adding less security and not ensuring that when people send content, move content, work with content inside of their platform, that it's once it's out of your platform, once it's you sent it, you kind of lose some of that security boundary. So that is why the security landscape is so big. I think what's really important, one I really like in this, is that 88% of organizations are no longer confident that they detect and prevent loss of sensitive data. And look at and 78% of people are using mobile devices for work, and this was all pre-COVID. So imagine what these numbers are going to be when we start to look at, when some of the analysis comes out after this, to see how much time is spent and what is the confidence level of companies about their ability to secure their data. 45% of organizations lack data governance, leaving them open to litigation and data security risks. People are using personal accounts for work. How do we ensure that we don't become some of these numbers? We don't become one of the 4.2 billion records that were compromised in the last year. And being compromised could also occur just from someone emailing a file inappropriately. It could be from, a good example is you have let's say your company has deployed Microsoft Teams, and all of a sudden you have a vendor come onto your Microsoft team and starts pulling data out of it. That you didn't mean to do it, you didn't try to do it. Technically, that's a type of data exfiltration. So how can we control that? What can we do to make sure we are more secure? And what I really like to think about for this one is, how do we get started? Because there's a lot that goes on, and because you do need to understand all of the areas that exist, right? So when you're thinking about security, you're thinking this from the end, from starting all the way to the identity, who you are, all the way down to how do we start tracking and reporting on that. And these are key pillars of information, key pillars, I would say, that where we need to think about security. So who's the person coming in? How are they getting in, and what are they using to get in? What application are they accessing, or what service are they going into? And then what kind of controls do we have either within that service or within the content for that service? And when you think about this, you put these all together, this is where some of the complexity comes in. Because when you're looking at your security platform, your security strategy, you need to think about these scenarios. If I'm coming in, am I requiring multi-factor authentication on an unmanaged device to a guest account who is accessing Outlook, and is DLP configured? I mean, that's a question that if you kind of walk from left to right on this, you'll start to see how all of these different levels of security can work together, whether it's from threat protection into domain joined machines versus BYOD devices. They work together. But today we're going to target a little bit more on the application and content side. So really looking at content, which is SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. This is content that lives inside of Microsoft 365. And what can we do to secure that content? Because the content is what makes up a lot of what makes up your platform. If you have Teams, OneDrive, and SharePoint without files, I mean, you really don't have much with OneDrive without files. So how do we make sure that all of these kind of things work together? And what's really important to know, first of all, is around files. So thinking about where files live and how they exist in the ecosystem of Microsoft 365. So they all live in SharePoint. OneDrive files are hosted in SharePoint. If you upload a file or create a new file in Teams, it's created in SharePoint. If I'm in Yammer and I create a file, it's stored in SharePoint. If I go in, I open up Office 365 and I click Word, that actually just write in Word through the app launcher, that's going to create a file in my OneDrive, which is technically hosted in SharePoint Online. And understanding that concept ensures that you will know what the file controls need to be that are shared across systems. So how do you have unified DLP policies? How do you know what we do for sensitivity labels across these different files? because what matters is we're managing the content services system behind the scenes. We're managing SharePoint and we're managing Microsoft 365, and that's where you start. And then the applications come in along for the ride. Now, when I talk with people around how to get started, just overall, if you said to look at that big screen, that big matrix of all the things that you needed to do, and you said, where do we need to do today? The first thing you need to make sure you move forward with is multi-factor authentication. Microsoft has stated last year that over 99% of breaches are mitigated if multi-factor authentication is enabled, but currently less than 20% of users are actually, or companies or organizations are usually utilizing multi-factor authentication. The ability to control that is very possible inside of Microsoft. So make sure you're at least doing it for your administrator accounts right now, and make sure you have a plan for how you're going to move to multi-factor authentication, potentially for your accounts, but also for especially for your guest accounts. The way those are handled is through conditional access. So conditional access is an Azure AD capability that you can actually say and declare, depending on certain scenarios, do certain things. So let's say I wanted to say, I want to make sure no one can join or log into Office 365 if they don't have, if they're not on a domain join machine. Done. That's a conditional access policy that you configure. What if I want to block access to something if I'm not on a certain network location? That's all done through conditional access. So that if you think of that, that's getting into your system. So now what if you're already in the system? Then you have data loss prevention. Data loss prevention policies allow you to, when content is stored within your system, or when you're sending email information out, you have policies that will identify content that can be triggered and stop those actions. So stop the data from being lost. And then the final one is making sure you plan your classifications. Look at what's available for sensitivity classifications and retention labels. So your sensitivity labels and retention labels, and start looking at what you can do for classifications. So if you even just did those for these first four, you would have and understand what the impact would be. You'd have a more secure landscape than you would today. Now around that, make sure you understand the governance of who owns conditional access, because those changes are very broad. Sharing controls, which I'll dive a lot more into. And then how do we know when certain things happen? So if someone does try to send some information, how do we alert on that and monitor for it? So think about that as I kind of walk through this session today around, this is what you should use to kind of get started. So let's dive into some of how to manage this. So we have the ability to manage this through two newer compliance centers. So they used to be called the Security and Compliance Center under protection.office.com, which is still used and you can still access it. But the majority of the information now is under the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center and the Microsoft 365 Security Center, which are two different locations, because realistically, when you look at who owns certain areas, you have a security team and you have a compliance team. There may be overlap, and that's okay. You'll see some of the information kind of redundant, but they are different locations for users for a better experience to kind of see this content. So this is really going to be where you start when you start administrating and securing your information. And why, we're talking about securing SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, but you'll see you don't secure them necessarily through any of the applications themselves. You can get more granular with your security. When you're looking at security in your platform, you're securing all of your files and all of your systems, which means you need to look holistically at Microsoft 365. If you're curious around your industry and your tenant, how is it doing? You do actually have the ability of the Secure Score. Secure Score has been around for a while, but has a new home in the Microsoft 365 Security Center. And from here, you'll be able to actually learn what features are available to you to reduce the risk of what or other areas you can do and recommendations to reduce that risk, or really kind of what you call improvement actions. So you could say, if I haven't turned on a certain policy, well, if I turn on that policy, I'd be addressing that as an improvement action. My secure score would go up, and I could see, even comparing to other industries, what does my secure score look like? So if you need to know kind of where to get started, again, you want to have just some base understanding. Maybe you've already had some configurations done in your tenant. Maybe you already have MFA enabled. The secure score can tell you a little bit more and some other options for you. Now, on the conditional access side, there's a lot that goes into it. The key information is you have conditions and you have controls. So think about, I have a condition that I want to have met. So I have a device and a condition. So I want to maybe say I want to have a, when a client is authenticating from a certain network, I want to put a control into. I want to allow or block it, limit it, or maybe a good example is require multi-factor authentication. So for all of us who are administrators who are administering these certain platforms, I'm logging in as a SharePoint administrator into my tenant. Maybe a great example is making sure that me as my account, which has a administrative control, will go through a conditional access policy and say, hey, Drew's coming in. He doesn't matter what location he's on because his account has a specific role. I'm going to require MFA for that account. And that's how these that can kind of be looped together. So let's take a look at the secure score and conditional access policies. So first of all, to get to the Security and Compliance Center, you can go to security.microsoft.com. And if you go to the Compliance Center, you can go to compliance.microsoft.com. You can also access them through the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. On the bottom left, you'll have options for getting into each of the compliance centers. The secure score is in the Microsoft 365 Security Compliance Center. So if I go into security.microsoft.com, click on secure score on the left, you'll actually be able to see your secure score along with all of the actions that you can address. And what's really cool is you can actually see down here a comparison of your score and the organizations like yours. And you can actually manage some of your comparisons to see which ones you could potentially compare to. So if I'm in financial services, or if I'm in, let's say, legal or the law firm industry, you can actually come out and compare that information along with seeing history of what's changed for a secure score. You'll see it since this is my demo tenant, I don't have a lot in here, but if I started to include more and complete any of these improvement actions, my score would go up. What's nice is these improvement actions tell me things that I can do. What can I address? How can I take these and enable them in my tenant to make them more secure? Because enabling these will make all of your applications more secure, because identity is your first way in. A lot of these are based around identity. A quick example on a conditional access policy. So I'm jumped over into Azure AD. So I am under portal.azure.com under my conditional access policy, and I created one called the guest CA policy. You will see I do have some baseline policies that are enabled, or that are available. First one is require MFA for admins. That's an example that I talked about before. But maybe I want to look at to kind of break into my own and do what I want. So what I can do is I can create a new policy. And right here, what I did is I'm going to say, depending maybe for specific users. So for this one, I'm going to say just for guests. So guests and external users. For which applications? SharePoint Online and Microsoft Teams. OneDrive is part of SharePoint Online. So basically I'm going to say if I'm accessing, if a guest is accessing either of those applications, and if they're coming in from any device, from browser or mobile application, so if a guest is coming in, I'm going to require multi-factor authentication. So that's an example of a conditional access policy. You can configure that enforces if you have guests coming into your tenant. So if I'm sharing a file, if I'm adding a user to a team, if I'm adding an external user to a SharePoint site, and when they log in, you want to make sure that they are the right people logging in. You can enforce multi-factor authentication for those guest accounts. But conditional access lets you do multiple different things, whether it's domain joins, blocking access, changing different apps, adding different conditions, all the way to the point of session level controls. But at a high level, it's really the part I want to make sure we understand is that conditional access controls your way in. And if you want to look at a good starting point, you can look at the Microsoft Secure Score to see some areas of improvement that you can start today. The next thing I want to talk about is data loss prevention. So let's say users are already in, once you get into your environment, so they've gone through that first step of conditional access, and someone starts to create content. When they create content, they can create things that are potentially are going to have sensitive information in it. So does it have, let's say, credit card numbers, social security numbers, health records? I worked with a company where we had a lot of fun with Canadian passport numbers and how they related to account numbers. Data loss prevention is about identifying information and ensuring you put actions around it. So DLP policies are based on locations with multiple rules, and then conditions based on those rules and actions to take because of them. So let's say I want to create a DLP policy that says I want to ensure that credit card numbers do not get exposed. What I can do is say I want to base this on specific locations. So I could do it for one OneDrive site, for all the way up to the entire organization. I'll say, okay, I want to say I have a DLP policy for all of OneDrive that anytime the rule is going to be when I find a credit card number. The conditions will be when I find a certain amount. So maybe I want to find every time I find 5 credit card numbers. What do you want to do? We can alert, we can notify, we can block access, and we can actually put further and deeper controls on those files depending on the information that's found in it. Now, what they are built on is what's considered sensitive information types. So there's a whole bunch of them that are already predefined for you, but you can create your own. And what's different about Microsoft 365 data loss prevention is that it's not the same as Exchange data loss prevention. So think of Exchange DLP, a very consistent process that happens in transit. So I send an email, not necessarily when I'm typing it, but during the transmission of that email is when DLP can happen. I can say, oh, let me look at this attachment and do something. What's a little bit different about Microsoft 365 DLP, first of all, Exchange is only for Exchange. This unified DLP covers all of your applications, including Exchange. So SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, this can go all the way into the level of Teams chats and Exchange, and say, I want to have the same policies across the board. For SharePoint side and SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams side, they're all based on search. So if I upload a file, once search crawls on it, or it's indexed, it will look for the specific sensitive information types you've defined and then perform those actions. So when you're configuring data loss prevention, there is a bunch of predefined sensitive information types. The reason I like to start with this up front of why you want to do it today is because it's easy. Because they already have predefined sensitive information types for you that you can just run with, and you can say, I want to start today identifying or reporting on all of the locations that have sensitive information, maybe let's say credit card information. I can do that right now. The way it works is that policies are synced to the content sources. So you do have policies that go all the way down to, for us, for SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. When rolling this out, make sure you have a plan to handle false positives. So you can do it today, but when you look at this and you run with it, you will have the ability, or there will be options for you to manage. So if someone creates a file, and if you have a file that has what looks like a credit card number into it, but it could just be a collection of numbers, make sure you have the plan for how you're going to handle that, because you can override it, or you can have the data force the data to be adjusted. When configuring it, priority is important. So you'll see in the order in that screenshot, you have order 0, 1, 2, 3. They do run in order. So if you have certain controls that need to stop certain things, those should be up there first. There is the ability to do test mode. So when I'm rolling it out, I can start it in test mode. And as you're going through it, there is a lot of ability for alerting and reporting. And one of the newer functionality is what's called sensitive by default. So I mentioned that when I uploaded a file, and if I put a credit card number into it, that search would run on it, and then it would identify that it has a credit card number, and then it would lock it or perform an action. That's considered sensitive. By default, it would wait for that crawl to run. So what you can do is you can enable sensitive by default, which assumes that the file is sensitive. So it doesn't allow you to do, in this example, external sharing until it just runs a check just to make sure. So it adds another layer just that you can't exfiltrate data, even if you didn't need to, by creating a file and sending it before it was indexed. And you can configure that in your tenant overall. So taking a look at data loss prevention. So data loss prevention, I'm going to move over to the Compliance Center. And over on the bottom left, you'll have the solutions location. If you want to catalog is where you'll be able to see it, and you can add it into your navigation, and you can get into the data loss prevention page. From here, you'll see the ability to create policies, export policies, search for different policies, but let's jump into one of them. So if I look at US financial data, you'll see this is actually enabled. You'll see the locations that this is applied into and different policy settings for it. Now, if I'm going to go in and edit this policy, just see as I have a name, and you have the different statuses. So do I want to turn it on right away? Do I want to test it out? Or do I want to create it and keep it off for now? And then you can also select the priority. So what's big is these right here. What are you going to do for testing out versus turning on right away? And this should be part of your plan of what you're going to do for these when you're deploying your DLP policies. Now, as I move into it, you'll see a couple different locations. You will see Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams and Chat. So you can get pretty granular with your control. So if you need to have DLP policies for specific OneDrive sites, maybe that are sharing externally, maybe some SharePoint sites need to have their own, or if you need to have Teams and Chat for DLP, that's also, you can kind of mix and match for your different locations. And you can even do exclusion rules. So if it's not just inclusion, it can also be exclusion. So depending on what your business need or your organization need, you can break it apart to exactly what you want. Jumping into a policy, you'll see I have two rules. So again, if you think of policies, they have rules, and those rules have conditions. So right now I have two rules of low volume of content and high volume of content. I jump into this, say edit rule. What you'll see is that we have a specific set of conditions, exceptions, actions, and a bunch of different stuff. But what's important is right here for what content contains. So if content contains a credit card number, a US bank account number, an ABA routing number, and how many times is it going to occur? So if it finds between 1 to 4 credit card numbers, it's going to do something. And then what is the confidence level that it's for? Well, what am I going to do? For this one, I'm actually not going to do anything. I'm just going to send user notifications. So I'm going to add user notifications. I'm going to notify these people. That's really about it. Because if it's 1 to 4, there's a good chance that it could be something wrong. It's a low incident report. There's nothing really. It's okay if someone had 1 or between 1 and 4. But what if we had more? So what if we went to high volume? I'll look at this rule. Look down. So I look down on my conditions. What I'm going to do is if you have more than that, I'm going to send a high severity alert. I'm going to send an email incident report and notify people. So I'm going to notify myself in this example, but I'm able to add different complexities based on what I need to. So this could be up to, maybe I want to have account numbers that have that appeared more than 10 times, maybe more than 20 times. All of that's possible. You can't even get to the point where I can, from an action standpoint, I can actually restrict access, remove headers, set headers, depending on what I would want to do. So if I really wanted to, if I saw more than 5, I could say, I actually want to restrict access to this content because I consider it a risk to our organization. And when I think about this, right, this is consistent for SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. This is not, we're looking at overall policies that would be applied to all of your applications. And what the experience looks like for that is if I have one of those files, I jump into Word, you're actually going to see this policy tip on top. This item is protected by a policy in your organization. So here's a bunch of credit card numbers. It's saying that's protected. If I can jump back into OneDrive here, you can see that little red guy right there, little red triangle, that's a policy tip. If I go into this document and I click on the document here, and I open up the info panel, you're also going to see the policy tip saying that this information is, this item contains sensitive information, must be authorized to receive this content. Look into it, you see what policy tip was occurred. The item contains the following sensitive information, credit card number. So that DLP policy we're just looking at shows that this file has a credit card number. And if I wanted to report a false positive, I have the ability to report a false positive right here. Now, if I come back in and look at what that looks like from a reporting standpoint, jump all the way up into the reports, which is also in the compliance, Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. Scroll down, you're going to see I have DLP incidents and DLP policy matches, and DLP false positives and overrides. If I look in the DLP policy matches section, you'll actually see here are the files that have recently hit DLP policy matches. So I uploaded other files in here, such as the Social Security number me document and the 10 megabyte test2 document that had sensitive information types. You'll see on this board that they show what policy matches occurred. So when you're thinking about securing your tenant in SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams, you can configure the DLP policies. But if you think about getting started, you do need to make sure you have the plan for matching these, right? When am I going to review these? Am I going to export these once a week? What's going to happen if I do have this information? And another cool thing about DLP is that they actually, since it does occur within search, as I'm creating a file, once the file is indexed, the policy will enable. So if I have this Word document open, if I removed, let's say I got rid of all of our sensitive information, once the policy or once search runs again, that policy will be removed because it no longer complies with that, no longer has sensitive information in it, so the restrictions would be lifted. So as we get a little bit more granular, we'll start talking more about the applications and how we look at sharing. So when we think about sharing is probably one of the most consistent ways that data exfiltration could happen. That I have a file somewhere in Teams, SharePoint, and OneDrive, and I share it, or I invite someone else into the team. So there are two levels of sharing. And the way that when you're configuring and securing SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams is it starts up at the top with Azure AD. So you have Azure AD settings, Office 365 runs on Azure AD. You have groups, which make up Teams and SharePoint for permissions. And then you can have group specific settings, and then all the way down to SharePoint site collection specific settings. So it's like it's a process as you slowly move through from the top. You have settings on the top that will affect the settings on the bottom. And that moves from more least restrictive to the most restrictive. So I could say, I want to turn off external sharing at the top. Fine. If I turn off external sharing in Azure AD, I can't enable external sharing in Teams. So you do need to make sure that when you are securing your environment, you understand the impacts of the identity up at the top, and how it affects your application specific settings. Now, for Microsoft 365 Groups external sharing, this really is what powers Teams and SharePoint. So if I wanted to invite someone into my team, the most common scenario, I created a Microsoft team and I want to invite someone else. First of all, you need to make sure that, what you can control is you can control at the very top of turning on or off external sharing, and that happens at the Azure level. Right? So these are Azure AD external sharing settings, and these are going to impact your applications. So I can turn on or off external sharing for Microsoft 365 Groups. If I turn it on, people will then be able to access, just by default, if I didn't change anything in Teams, people could add external users into my team. Then from that, I can turn it off per workload. And I do have some more complex capabilities, such as maybe do I want to allow guests to invite other guests or not? Do I want to perform a guest access review? And getting even into the details of performing domain allow blocks for maybe I want to enable sharing for Microsoft for Teams, but I only want to share with these 4 vendors. So I don't really care who those vendors are, who once they're in those or any of the users in those vendors, but they can share with them without a problem. So make sure you plan for these as you're starting to secure your SharePoint and Teams environments. Now, SharePoint, now that's accessing the content. Think of that as accessing the container. Okay, so just, if I added someone into a team or a SharePoint site, they could access everything. But what about the files? And how does that affect OneDrive? So what you can do for controlling sharing and how to make things more secure is understand what you want to have enabled. And sharing, you can control who, what, and which users you're going to be sharing into, and how those links are going to be used, how the external users are going to be interacting with those files. So you can declare who has the ability to share to external users. Maybe I only want my sales team. Maybe I only want them to be able to share specific teams. Maybe I only want them to share specific sites or specific OneDrive sites. Maybe I want to control only this team to share externally while all the others can't at the file level, right? Maybe I'm in Teams and I say share file. That's not adding someone to the team, but I can get granular enough to control that. And if I can say, maybe they only can share with other guests, or maybe they can only share internally. They can't add other guests, also an option. And the last one is you can get very detailed into how links can be shared. So I can block external links. I can add expiration dates. I can disable external sharing overall, or I can even do some things like blocking download of specific files for by my choice. So I'm in an Excel file, I share it, I can say block download. That's great. My choice as the person who's sharing it. But as the administrators, these are ways you can ensure that you add security into SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. Now, when looking at important to note about sharing, the sharing configurations for files. So if I open up Teams and I share a file, those are going to be managed through SharePoint, because as this is back up to the front, where do files live? They live in SharePoint, which means your SharePoint Online sharing settings determine the sharing settings for OneDrive and for Teams. And that means sharing for OneDrive can be more restrictive, but not less restrictive than SharePoint Online. So what that means is I can, if I wanted to allow anonymous access or anyone access into OneDrive, I would also have to have SharePoint enable anonymous access, because OneDrive lives in SharePoint. The same with Teams. If I wanted to have anonymous access in Teams, or maybe guest access in Teams, I need to make sure SharePoint Online has guest access enabled. What does that look like? So if I jump into the SharePoint Admin Center here, jump into the new one, you're going to have a section on the left that's called sharing. And for all of your file sharing needs, the SharePoint Admin Center sharing section is where you want to go to configure and manage and really lock down your sharing settings to something that you want. Because this will affect Teams as well, and of course OneDrive. So let's say I wanted to make SharePoint more, I wanted to allow anonymous access in OneDrive, but I want to not allow anonymous access in SharePoint. You'll see as I drag the slider down, I'm able to lock down SharePoint, but at that same time, I'm also locking down OneDrive. So if I try to move this up, you'll see it actually stops me. So you need to make sure that, well, it forces you, but you have to have OneDrive be, or SharePoint be more permissive than OneDrive. And as you break into this, you can actually get a little bit more detailed for sharing settings themselves. So maybe I want to share, do domain-based sharing for my files. Maybe I want to only allow specific users in a group. So we're talking about, maybe I want a sales team or your product team or someone, they're the marketing team, maybe they're the only ones that can share externally. That's all possible. Think of this as how we can control external sharing for files. You can get all the way to the point of defaults. So do I want to have a default link for people? And what are the ability? Maybe I don't even, what are the abilities for the links that I give people? Maybe I want to make sure whenever I share anonymous links that no matter what, they can only view. So we actually have the option that's saying when I'm doing anonymous links, I can get very detailed in the permission model for doing anonymous links. And if I want to just disable anonymous and say maybe they get the most secure, this is your action. But I will say, from a security standpoint, it is highly recommended to enable anonymous where you can. Your secure score actually gets worse if you have anonymous disabled, because if you have anonymous disabled, people will email files, and when someone emails a file, it is gone out of your company. If I have a file in OneDrive and I share it anonymously, it's still sitting in my OneDrive. If I need to revoke it, if I screwed up, I can turn it off, I can track it. If I email it, I can't. So think about that, of having this as a good thing, and it'll make people happy. And the last one on our big list of kind of getting started is around sensitivity labels. So content is king, right? We're talking about files, we're talking about content. Now, what about content if it does leave the environment? Or how can I figure out what kind of content that exists in my environment? People will say, well, my content's all unstructured. Unstructured data. I don't know what's here. How do I know that this needs to be secured? Or how do I know that I need to do something maybe based on a specific file type, or sorry, a specific label? You can actually manually or automate labels that can secure your content and actually add encryption to those or protection policies on those, where I can ensure that a file will always be safe. So let's say I have source code, right? Let's say I have product source code, or board meeting minutes. That's a good one. Board meeting minutes have a specific retention policy around them, different concept, but I also need to make sure that those board meeting minutes will never be exposed, that only the people in my organization can access my board meeting minutes. So what you can do is I could create a sensitivity label. Let's call it highly confidential. When I create a file and I add a sensitivity label of highly confidential, what can happen is I can say this file can only be accessible by people logging in with my account, or sorry, in my organization. So if I took that file and I emailed it, no one could open it. If I put it up on Dropbox, if I put it on Twitter, people can't open that file because I've added encryption onto it that controls that access. There is a difference between sensitivity labels and retention labels. So, and you would actually go to two different admin centers for these. So retention labels allow you to retain the content, retain and delete the content, while sensitivity labels give the ability to add encryption, content marking, perform specific DLP activities on those, and they persist with the file no matter where they are. So if it sits on my desktop, if it sits in Google, if it sits on someone else's desktop, they will still have that sensitivity label applied to them, while retention lives within the container. It's two very different concepts, but they're both types of classification. There is a difference, so there is an evolution of Azure information protection into sensitivity labels. If you're not there yet, the investment is being made into sensitivity labels. They use a similar back end, so they are still using Azure Rights Management behind the scenes to manage this information. But you do want to start investing your time into sensitivity labels, which are available in the Microsoft 365 Security Center. From a technical standpoint, there are clients that run. So if you're running AIP, you need to have a client installed. What's nice about sensitivity is that the newest versions of Office actually have this all built in. And now, as of in the last month, you can actually have sensitivity labels in Office Online, and coming very soon, actually next month in June, it's in preview today, you'll have the ability to do sensitivity labels on your sites and teams. So really starting to classify and secure your content from a classification standpoint using sensitivity labels. If you are still in AIP, you can migrate labels into sensitivity. And there's a great process out there and a lot of documentation around the migration of labels. What actually happens is you'll start to slowly move and use the security and compliance location, the security location, for managing your labels once you perform that migration. But at that point, you'll actually see labels in both of your environments. But you will want to start moving into sensitivity. The vision for this around unified labels with really sensitivity is combining this between Office 365, Windows, Azure. It's about securing content overall. So there's even a public preview right now for using sensitivity labels in Power BI. Bringing this back into Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive, what's important is that, let's say I'm syncing files in OneDrive. Right? Let's say I go somewhere or I open up the file on my mobile device. If I open up Teams and I open up the file in Teams, the sensitivity, the unified labels vision works across all of SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams. So how does that look? I can jump into a file here, jump into that file is actually working with, and what you're going to see, so I'm in Office Online. Over here on the right, you're going to see this new sensitivity drop down up here on top. This is now GA, you do need to turn it on, but as I drop it down, you're going to see a collection of labels. So these are the sensitivity labels I have defined for my organization, and these can do different things. I can also if I jump into the thick client, because I open up that same document, I have the same policy tip on top. For this, I've actually enabled a what's called a classification bar. You see on top here, I have my sensitivity labels up here with different colors that I can set up. So if I take this file, it doesn't have a sensitivity label applied to it. Let's say I'm going to add business use to it. You're going to see I've now applied business use. That's the sensitivity label. As long as the file stays like this, it's going to have the business use sensitivity label. On what I did is I also included down here in the footer, a footer called business use. I can change that. Maybe I want to make, oh, actually this was public. Oh wait, I didn't mean to make it public. I want to make it business use. You can still kind of change between these. I can make it, let's say move it to my pink sensitive. You'll see I added a header in here called sensitive do not share. And now I can start to report on this information and see where these files are moving. The same happens if I open up like Excel, I'll have the same toolbar. If I opened up Office for Mac, if I opened up my mobile devices on iOS and Android, the same sensitivity label experience, I shouldn't say the same experience, the ability to apply sensitivity labels exists across the platform. And when I move that from an admin side, I jump into my sensitivity label section. You'll see I have a collection of sensitivity labels available. These are the ones that I've created and migrated. You'll see I have business use, or restricted, and sensitive. And what I can do for each of these is I can declare, do I want to add encryption? Do I want to add content marking? So for this one, we saw my business use footer. I can now add sites and group settings. So when I create a new team, I can actually add a sensitivity label for that, and I can add security controls for that team once it's being created. And one of the coolest things that you can do is actually auto labeling and auto classification for these. So when you're thinking about if you're thinking about crawl, walk, run for securing your content, you can actually move all the way into auto classification. So if I had a file that had sensitivity in, that had I had a file, I uploaded a social security number into it, I could automatically apply a sensitivity label into it. Let's say I can make it highly confidential, which means no matter where that file went, it could never leave. If it did try to leave, we'd have a DLP policy that could fire onto it. If someone tried to access it, we have a conditional access policy that could deny it. And the DLP policy could also stop it from ever being shared externally. And if you do want to let someone in, you can force them through MFA, and you get that full picture of how these things can come together by securing securing this information through information protection and governance. It's knowing your data, it's protecting your data, and then governing your data. So figure out what you have using the classifications, using the first of all, understanding that files live in SharePoint and OneDrive and Teams, know where that data lives, protect it using different policies through encryption, through data loss prevention, protect it from people getting in, and then govern it through things like through the reporting that I kind of showed you today to see what's going on in your environment. And if you include these information protection and governance concepts, you're going to be able to secure SharePoint, OneDrive, and Teams in your environment, because you're not necessarily just securing the application, you're securing all of the content and the things that live inside of it. Now, if you look at kind of my going advice, when you're looking at this, complexity is your worst enemy of security. Don't overthink your classifications. Don't try to overcomplicate your security controls. Don't make incredibly complex conditional access policies, and don't make it too hard to share content. Find that balance when you're working in Microsoft Teams to let your users feel comfortable, but then that you feel comfortable too. Don't lock it down just to lock it down, and make sure your team as an IT professional and your organization, they understand the security controls that are in place. Make sure they know what happens if they do send something that has a credit card number into it. So perform the education within your team for what policies you have enabled, and educate your whole organization. There's the processes around that to let people know, if you send this, we're going to know. Just don't send it. So bringing that all together, I think we'll have time, obviously, to run right to the bullet. So not sure if there's any questions. I can pull that back up, but feedback is very welcome. I'll jump to the end and stay on for another minute here. If we need to get a hold of me, that's my contact information. But other than that, any questions that kind of came through, Alistair, for that?
We do. Thanks, Drew. It's always an interesting conversation when we start talking about unified labeling coming from the old AD RMS days or IRM policies, pulling through to sensitivity labeling now in the security center. There were a few questions around this. I think there was one around, you mentioned apparently that there was a way to compare the compliance score to other companies using it.
Yep, so to be able to compare that, there actually is the option inside of the secure score.
Oh, so it's not the compliance score, it's the secure score.
It is the secure score, yeah. So the compliance score, those are two very different scores today. The compliance score is still kind of in preview. You can not see that I'm aware of compliance against other organizations, but the secure score you can compare by industry. So if I go in the secure score and you go into manage organization, I think it's called, manage comparisons right here. Under manage comparisons, you can actually pick what industries you want to compare it to. So it will based on your organization's information, but I can go in and pick a type of industry to compare what my secure score would be compared to others.
Perfect. That does answer that question. There was another one around, do sensitivity labels work in Office Mobile?
They do, yeah. So for a longer demonstration, it's great, but they fully support it in Office Mobile, in Office for Mac, Office Online, all of them fully supported. It's kind of hard to get to. So when you see it, you have to go into the property section in Office Mobile, and you can go in and set sensitivity, but the same controls are available. So if you needed to, if I enabled sensitivity, deploy them to a user, they would see these options in the mobile device, in your Word app, on your iPad or whatever device you're on.
Okay. Can we use third-party MFA providers for conditional access policies instead of the standard ones? So like Ping and the others.
Yeah, you can integrate them. There's integrations available into using third-party. I was just working with a customer that just shifted from Ping. They had Ping MFA integrated into conditional access.
Yeah.
They shifted over to Microsoft, but from the Authenticator app standpoint. But absolutely, you can can integrate them from Okta or Ping, or pick your poison for which one you want.
There was another question around metadata being preserved when making these changes. If a document is under investigation, can you see the history of sensitivity labels? So if you applying a higher level or downgrading the sensitivity label?
That's a really good one. So when every change is logged in the audit log. So as long as your audit log information is stored, or you keep audit logs for sensitivity, for just in general, you would have that information. It is logged every time you change it, or you can force justification if you move it down. So I don't have it set up here, but let's say I move it from public into highly confidential, or highly confidential to public. I can force justification for that and track that under a audit trail. So store that somewhere else to make sure we always have this history of that. As long as the data is in the audit log, so for up to 90 days, that is there. If you need it longer, you need to pull it out or buy some more licensing.
There were questions around encrypted files and moving it between tenants. Do you have to unencrypt it when you move it?
It depends on the encryption. So if my highly confidential one here is an encrypted one, the conditions are stored actually within. No, I'm hitting time, so the conditions for those.
We've got 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
So you can, but it depends on what encryption policy you put on there. So for my highly confidential one here, as an example, my encryption policy I put in place is saying only people in Drew's team have access to this file.
Yeah.
So there's a whole section kind of around encryption here. So yeah. If you send it to another tenant, this file using this encryption, no. If I change the permission model here to do something different, absolutely.
Because it's based on your UID, your UPN, right, for the user. So that's going to change at a tenant level, and your UPN is going to be unique, and it won't work.
Yep.
So
that's just for the big one. Like if you wanted to say where you can assign permissions, you can do all of these different areas. So the most common one you see is like domains. So like I wanted to share with Microsoft.com. So if I put that information here and someone opened up with a Microsoft.com account, that's what would matter. To your point, Alistair, it's not about where it's located, but who's accessing it when they're logged in Office, who's accessing that file with that account.
Okay. Geo-tracking. In the old days with AIP, you could do track RMS.
Track and revoke. Track and revoke is TBD. Okay. That is the one that's in the roadmap, but that is the one reason why people the one big reasons I've seen people stay with AIP is for track and revoke. Tell the AIP team more so they can, because I want that too.
The feature parity is not there yet.
Correct.
Okay, let's see if we've got. Okay, yes, you'll be able to rewatch. This session is recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel for the conference.
And for anything else, I think just for time, I mean, I'll stop presenting here. Just make sure we kind of stay in cadence.
Yeah.
But it was good.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Drew. I spent quite a bit of time in this space and I learned quite a bit from you. So I'm excited that I have another person that I can ping in the community to ask these questions. I'm sorry for those that we didn't get to on the question side. We did
email me. Feel free to ping me on Twitter. Send me an email on LinkedIn. Send me an email, ping me on LinkedIn, whatever. I'm open to talk about security and compliance, whatever. So